You know how this works. We dig through a mountain of research and pull out the most interesting bits. It's like having a cheat sheet to sound like you're an expert on all sorts of topics.
Mm-hmm.
And today we're going to be diving into something that sounds kind of scary,
Yeah.
aflatoxins.
Uh-huh.
But thankfully we have Sarah here, our expert guide, to walk us through it.
Well, thanks. It's true. Aflatoxins sound a little intimidating, but like most things, knowledge is power. Once you know what they are and how to avoid them, it's really not that bad.
All right, so let's break this down. The sources you sent over mention that aflatoxins are a type of mycotoxin. Can you explain that? What exactly does that mean?
Sure, mycotoxins are basically toxic substances produced by fungi, including molds. You can kind of think of them like the defense mechanisms of fungi.
Interesting.
These toxins can have all sorts of effects on different organs, leading to different health problems.
Uh-huh.
And aflatoxins are like the VIPs of the mycotoxin world.
Okay.
They're some of the most well-known and unfortunately some of the most dangerous.
So are you saying that, like, if I see a piece of bread that's moldy, there's a chance that it has these aflatoxins in it?
It's possible aflatoxins are made by specific types of mold called Aspergillus fungi,
Okay.
most commonly Aspergillus flavus and Aspergillus parasiticus.
Wow, those are some big words.
Yeah, they are.
I'll trust you on the
I
pronunciation.
got it.
So these molds, they like to grow in warm, humid places. And they're particularly drawn to things like grains and peanuts.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I remember in one of the articles that peanuts and corn were often mentioned as high-risk foods for aflatoxin contamination. So if we're eating these foods, are we just like exposing ourselves to these toxins?
Well, not necessarily. The good news is there are ways to minimize the risk. But you're right, the main way we come into contact with aflatoxins is through eating contaminated food. That's why it's so important to understand how these toxins get into our food in the first place.
Okay, so how do they get there? How do these aflatoxin-producing molds get into our food? Does it happen like while the food is still growing?
It can start there. Yeah, Aspergillus molds can infect crops like corn and peanuts when they're still in the field.
Oh, wow.
Things like insects damaging the crops, drought stress, or just poor storage conditions can all make the crops more likely to get infected by the fungus.
So if a farmer doesn't take care of their crops properly, they're more likely to be contaminated.
Exactly. And it doesn't end there.
Mhm.
Even after harvest, if the food's not stored properly, it can create the perfect environment for mold to grow.
Yeah.
Imagine like a damp, poorly ventilated storage facility. It's basically an open invitation for Aspergillus to take over and start making aflatoxins.
That's a little unsettling.
Yeah, it is. And here's the really tricky part. Even if those crops are processed, those aflatoxins can stick around.
Oh, no.
Like, imagine you're at the grocery store and you're buying a bag of flour or peanut butter. You wouldn't even think about it, right?
Right.
But those things could actually have aflatoxins from contaminated grains or peanuts. It's basically impossible to tell without special testing.
That's kind of scary.
Oh.
So it's not as simple as just like looking for mold.
Right. Just because you don't see mold doesn't mean those aflatoxins aren't there.
Okay, so I'm really starting to understand why this is a big deal. But before we get too worried, let's talk about what can be done about it. The sources you sent mentioned some efforts to reduce aflatoxin contamination. Like, what kind of things are people doing?
Well, the most important thing is to prevent in the first place. Good agricultural practices or the first line of defense. Things like using the right irrigation techniques, managing pests properly, and harvesting the crops carefully. All of those things help minimize crop damage and stress, which in turn makes it harder for those aspergillus molds to take hold.
So it starts with the farmers. But what about after the crops are harvested? How important is storage?
Oh, storage is super important.
Okay.
Those harvested grains and nuts have to be stored in a dry, well-ventilated place to stop mold from growing. Temperature control is also really important. It's all about making it as hard as possible for those aflatoxin-producing molds to grow.
It sounds like it's a pretty big effort from the farms to the storage facilities. Are there any new technologies being developed? Like, is there anything like an aflatoxin zapper or something?
That's a cool idea.
Right.
There's no magic zapper yet, but there are some pretty promising things in the works.
Oh, cool.
Like there's a treatment that uses ammonia gas. It's called ammoniation, and it's been pretty effective at getting rid of toxins in animal feed.
So they've figured it out for animal feed, but not for human food yet.
Exactly. Ammoniation isn't really approved for human food because there are some concerns about safety, flavor, and nutrition, but scientists are working on other things like cold plasma treatment, which uses energized gas to neutralize the toxins, and also enzymatic detoxification,
Wow.
which uses enzymes to break down aflatoxins.
That's fascinating. So it sounds like there's a lot of research being done to try to get rid of these things. But let's talk about the health risks.
Yeah.
We haven't really gotten into why we should care about aflatoxins. How dangerous are they?
This is where things get serious. Aflatoxins are classified as carcinogens, which means they can cause cancer. Long-term exposure, even at low levels, has been linked to liver cancer, especially in places where people also have hepatitis B.
I remember reading a study about some workers in a peanut processing plant in the Netherlands. They were exposed to aflatoxin-contaminated dust. And the researchers found a connection between aflatoxin exposure and a higher risk of not just respiratory cancers, but all types of cancer.
Yeah, it's definitely something to be aware of.
For sure.
Yeah.
And it's not just the long-term effects we have to worry about, right? There's also something called acute aflatoxicosis, which happens when someone's exposed to a lot of aflatoxins all at once. And that can be deadly.
Right, it can lead to liver failure and a whole bunch of really serious symptoms.
So it's definitely not something to take lightly. But it's good to know that there are ways to lower the risk. We talked about those big prevention methods. But what can we do as individuals to protect ourselves from aflatoxins?
That's a great question. And the answer is actually pretty simple. The first and most obvious thing is to not eat food that has mold on it. It might seem obvious, but it's important to remember that mold can sometimes be hiding beneath the surface.
Oh, wow.
So if something looks or smells off, just trust your gut and throw it out.
When in doubt, throw it out. Got it. Any other tips? Especially when it comes to processed foods where it's harder to tell if they're aflatoxins?
I would say choosing brands that have good quality control measures is a good strategy. You want to make sure your food comes from places that take aflatoxin contamination seriously.
That makes sense. Are there other things we should look for? Like, are there organizations that provide information on aflatoxin levels in food?
Absolutely. A lot of countries have set limits for how much aflatoxin is allowed in different food products. You can check with your local food safety agencies or international organizations like the World Health Organization. And don't forget that eating a variety of foods can also help. Don't just rely on one or two sources for your food.
So it's all about being informed, making good choices, and mixing things up.
Yeah.
That's reassuring. I feel like I'm already getting a better handle on how to lower my risk. Is there anything else we should keep in mind?
Well, it's important to remember that we've been talking a lot about aflatoxins today.
Yeah.
But they're just one type of mycotoxin. There are a lot of different fungi out there that produce all sorts of toxins, some of which we might not even know about yet. So the important thing is to be aware, stay informed, and make smart choices about the food you eat.
That's a really good point. So aflatoxins are something to be aware of, but there's no need to panic. By understanding the risks and taking some simple precautions, we can really reduce our exposure. I feel like we've really learned a lot today about these aflatoxins. It's been a fascinating deep dive. Before we finish up, is there anything else you think our listeners should know about aflatoxins or mycotoxins in general?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that knowledge is power. The more you know about things like aflatoxins, the better you'll be able to make smart choices about what you eat. And remember, this isn't about being afraid. It's about being informed and taking simple steps to protect yourself.
I love that. So, to all our listeners out there, the next time you're at the store picking out peanuts or flour, remember what we talked about today? Be mindful, be informed, and make good choices. And hey, maybe even share what you've learned with your friends and family.
Exactly. Spread the word, not the mold.
I like that.
And one last thought. If aflatoxins, something we've known about for decades, can still be such a big problem for food safety, what other mycotoxins could be out there that we don't even know about yet?
Wow, that's a good question. It makes you realize how important it is for scientists to keep doing research and for all of us to stay vigilant about our food.
Definitely.
Well, this has been another amazing deep dive. It's incredible how much we can learn about the world around us just by taking a closer look at things like aflatoxins.
It really is.
That's what makes these deep dives so fascinating. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.